Hi, I'm Mark Upton from teamsportcoaching.com, and today we've got the third and our final instalment on this series about performance analysis and how it fits in the coaching process. And quickly to recap what we've covered so far, in the first part we talked just about how analysis fits in the coaching process and some more philosophical things rather than anything too specific or specifics of technology and software you might use. The second part used sports code as a basis to get an understanding of how match analysis might work and how the sports code system functions to provide both the visual and numerical information that can really assist you as a coach. But today, the third part, and this is the bit that really excites me more so, is how do we then apply that analysis into the next stage of coaching, I suppose, which is generally designing your training and how you teach players or groups or your team the game. Because in general, if we're talking about match analysis, for example, you can obviously analyse a lot of other areas of performance, but generally you analyse that, you get results, you then make decisions which, if you're looking for changes in behaviour or improvement in performance, has to come through training. So it's a natural extension. So I just want to talk about a few things that tie together in this stage of the process. So application of training and teaching. Really important point is this quote here from Richard McGill. Okay, it's a common one that's quoted in skill acquisition literature, and it's a real key point obviously in how you design your training activities, and hence analysis has an important role to play in the design and to ensure that that transfer happens. So how is that? Well, the first way can be in terms of auditing the game and making sure that your training design matches those demands and mimics the game. So when we say audit, it could be, for example here, this is an audit of looking at all the types of kicks in a game of Australian football. So this could apply to soccer as well quite easily, and probably other sports. All the types of kicks, what happens before the kick, after the kick, the perceptual demands, distance of kick, all these things. So it's a comparison looking at the percentages that occur in a game versus this study analysed a certain team training sessions over a period of time to look at the percentage breakdown there. So ideally, we say, the quote from McGill was that practice needs to resemble the game. The disparities here, I think, are quite significant. So by doing this audit process and analysis, you find that, for example, in 7 to 8 seconds processing time before needing to kick, in a game that happens about 4 out of 10 times. In training though, it's happening 7 out of 10 times. So in this team's case, in training, on a lot of occasions, the kicker is being allowed an inordinate amount of time to make a decision or to get into his kick when compared to the game situation. The other disparities, no use of evasive skills prior to kicking, or no use of evasive skills. So only 3 out of 10 times in a game you don't have to use any evasion skills prior to your kick. In training, almost 9 out of 10 times no evasion skills. So again, we're not replicating the demands, and we're not really overloading the players or even loading the players to a level of the match demands. And the final inequity there is moderate perceptual load, or when a player looks up and is looking to kick and pick his options, what's the amount of player density or complexity ahead of him to make that decision? In a game, roughly 3 out of 4 kicks were tagged as having moderate perceptual load or complexity, but in training, only 1 out of 5 of these kicks achieve that. So just those 3 areas there, I think, are all crucial areas, suggest that in this case, training did not mimic the game enough. And in terms of any improvement in performance, if you talk overload, certainly isn't overloading players. And the interesting one is, in terms of kick hitting the target, in training almost 9 out of 10 kicks hit. In a game, 6 out of 10. So what we're doing here is really training for success. And what you find is coaches often will be happy that, gee, the training looks good. This figure here, 9 out of 10 hit. But what's happening is this figure here, 6 out of 10 in a game hitting, that figure doesn't improve. What might have to happen, and this is often a bit controversial, is in training, you might have to make it so challenging that only 50% of targets are hit, so that in a game, maybe this figure here raises to 70% or 80%. Okay, so there's an example of auditing your training versus your game, and I'd say in this case here, finding that your training is not really demanding enough compared to the game. So what about just looking at some vision, so we know if we code certain types of kicks, that in sports code we can then quickly pull out those and look at the types of kicks that occur in the situations to help design our training. So here's an example of just in Australian football, the range of kicks that could occur into the forward 50 or the attacking area, and look at the movement of the player receiving the ball. So running back to goal, look at the time and space, whether the kick is on the run, so there's a lateral movement, the length of the kick, so on the run, short to a player presenting up at the kicker, on the run more to a stationary contest from the forward. Here's one where rather than being on the run, a mark's taken and then wheeling around and entering to a lead. Same thing, wheeling around, finding a free player. Wheeling around again and going long to, again, a more stationary one-on-one contest. So there's just a few examples of the types of forward entry kicks we see in a game. So you can then design your training drills around those kicks. And then the other thing we can look at is, rather than necessarily individual skills that occur in the game, is often in team-based games you obviously train phases of the game, counter-attacks, set play situations, movement and integration between the midfield area into the forward or attacking area. And so we can look at, in the same way, audit how often do these phases occur. So obviously the ones that occur more often, we perhaps need to train more, and we might also look at how critical some of these phases are. We might have some other analysis that shows us how important they are to the success of the result or not. So this was from a few years ago in a game of Australian football, how often we counter-attack our defence, how often we kick it in, how often stoppages occur in different parts of the game, midfield turnovers, etc., etc. So we can design our phase training around those and allocate the appropriate time and importance to those certain phases. So there's some ideas about auditing to apply to your training design. The other really important thing that you get out of doing good analysis, coding games, looking at patterns of similar clips, is you start to really understand the dynamics of the game from a bigger picture point of view. You might have played the game as an individual, regardless of what the game is. You really don't get that global view and understanding of patterns and how space evolves and how different defensive formations impact offensive play until you've looked at the game thoroughly. Ben Hart, who's one of the assistant coaches in Australian football side, has made this comment that he was one of the champion defenders in the last 20 or 30 years of the game. He believes he could have been an even better player if he'd understood it as he does now as a coach, having after the last 5 or 6 years used sports code, analysed the game closely, looked at the data. Has been a real valuable process that he thinks could have been valuable when he was a player. So it just highlights, though, the importance of going through that. And what you'll find is that for all good coaches, all good teachers, for that fact, in any domain, is they need good subject matter expertise. So needing to understand the dynamics of the game to be able to teach it. And by using sports code analysis, you can really speed up that process. So an experienced coach who's coached for 40 years, he will implicitly have learnt a lot about the game and he will detect these patterns. But by using the modern analysis tools, in the space of probably 2 to 3 years, you can watch an inordinate amount of games or certain phases or concepts and really get to understand the dynamics of them well, which leads into your training. So breakdown drills. And Duke talks about your breakdown drills being snapshots of your system. So it might be in basketball, just the defensive transition phase when from a opposition rebound from your own missed shot. And in sports code, so obviously here, this row here of instances, this could be defensive transition. So here's your little snapshots here. So like we talked about in previous episodes, you can click on this row and play all your defensive transition clips, look at what's working, what's not, look at the dynamics, what are the numbers, 2 on 1, 3 on 2, 4 on 4, what's the time it takes to get up and down the floor in this case. Design your breakdown drills around those key variables that you pick out. And that leads on to another important point in terms of designing or incorporating the variables that exist is something called constraints. Okay. So in a training activity context, manipulating constraints could be things like the time and space available. So player density, number of players up, the size of the field, whether the offence has more numbers than the defence or around the other way. It can be things like wind, wet, slippery conditions, for example. Things like pressure, so trying to create a pressurised environment, like if the next team to score, the other team runs laps, or creating that external pressure. So there's a lot of ways of manipulating constraints. That's probably a whole other discussion. But if you understand the dynamics of the game and what you're trying to create in your training drill or activity, then you'll understand the nuances of manipulating these constraints to guide players towards the learning and the behaviour that you're trying to achieve. Here's an example from a completely unrelated field, but it gives you an idea of how manipulating constraints or the environment guide people towards a certain behaviour. So that's an example, completely unrelated field, but good example of changing the environment to achieve the desired behaviour. In a sporting context, soccer or football, the change might be a rule. So you want your team to switch the play, they get points. There's a new rule, they score or get points by, if every time they switch the play, you'll get that change in behaviour. Another real important reason why analysis is important to understand the dynamics of the game is identifying the coachable moment in these training activities. So what are the real key or core decisions either on or off the ball that your players have to make, or that are the focus of where you want some improvement from? Being able to recognise those moments while you're coaching, and the coachable moment is basically freezing the play, getting players in the positions they were when that decision was made, and then using a questioning, not a telling approach, questioning approach to see what players were thinking. Maybe the right action was taken or the wrong action, it doesn't really matter, but you can facilitate this understanding in the moment when players are out there doing the activity, which is, I think, the best way to reinforce the coaching points and the learning and the behaviour that you want. And you can also, in terms of using video, since we've talked a lot about video and video analysis, we can recreate this coachable moment off the field too. So here's a custom program we've used in the past where the video clip here plays. It's playing a certain passage or ball movement out of defence. At a certain point in time, the clip pauses and a question is asked: what should the circle, what's the circle player? What could he have done better? So we're replicating that coachable moment off the field, a player on the computer. Okay, he doesn't have to physically expend any more information, but he can still be learning the tactical side of the game, and he can respond with his answer down here in the comments section, which a coach can then come in and assess and discuss with him at a later stage. So I think there's an example. Quite often I talk about off-field learning and some of the great online options that are available now to coaches. There's a way of replicating the coachable moment and a way of teaching and improving your players off the field as well. And the final point, and I'm really strong on this one, designing your drills, if you understand the game, if you analyse the game, if you're clear on what the key variables and constraints are in it, what you're trying to achieve and get better in, you shouldn't have to say, I need more drills. You shouldn't have to go to your coaches association or other coaches or whoever it is and use what I call the cut and paste approach of, oh, that's a good drill, well, I'll cut and paste that into my practice session for tonight. You should be able to, in less than 10 minutes, by understanding these things, make up your own drill to achieve what you want, manipulate the constraints and the variables, time and space, scoring, etc., etc. Make sure players are going to get enough involvement and all the equipment and whatever. You should be able to design your own drills, because that's going to be the most effective way for you to coach and get the best results for your individual players and your team. So I've covered a bit again there in terms of applying the next step from analysis into design and implementation of training and teaching. Again, encourage you, just jot down 1 or 2 things max that you might be able to put into action that you've heard about today that could possibly help you in your coaching in the next 2 or 3 months. That's all I've got. Good luck in your coaching. If you're in season or for the upcoming season, you can of course contact me and get in touch. I'd love to hear from you with any feedback or questions or comments at these addresses and locations.